Hello and welcome to today's Make It Safe Expert Series, Ask Me Anything session on mental health with Dr. Steve Conway. My name is Anna Rowinska and I am your technical host. Thank you for joining us. To adjust your audio settings, click the microphone at the bottom left of your screen, then click the up arrow to select audio controls. To ask a question at any time, click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Use the comment section to chat with other attendees, share your thoughts, and let us know where you're from. Steve will respond to as many questions as he can during today's session. This Ask Me Anything session is sponsored by Alliance, Allied Partner, and Canadian Disability Management Leader, TextMed Services. Our moderator today is Doris Toman, Services Experience Manager at the Manufacturing Safety Alliance of BC. Welcome, Doris.
Thank you, Anna. Welcome, everyone. I am joining you from the Fraser Valley office of the Manufacturing Safety Alliance of BC, located in Chilliwack on the traditional and unceded territories of the Stalo Coast Salish people. I am grateful for the opportunity to speak to everyone from these shared lands today. To give you a little bit of information about the Alliance, the Manufacturing Safety Alliance is the not-for-profit health and safety association for manufacturers and food processors in BC. Our team of health and safety experts is here to answer your questions and to assist you towards core certification, the occupational safety standard of excellence for manufacturing. We are here to support the continuous improvement of your health and safety programs to prevent injuries and promote workplace wellness. Call on us anytime for health and safety training, information, tools, or advice. With more and more interest in mental health and psychological wellness, we at the Alliance launched our mental health strategy in 2021 that looked at how to help manufacturers and food processors integrate psychological well-being into the existing workplace health and safety programs. Many of our members have made some inroads, but there is still a long way to go. So today's Ask Me Anything session will be on mental health with Dr. Steve Conway, Mental Health and Wellness Director at the Alliance. Steve joined the Alliance last fall, bringing to our team more than 30 years of experience providing mental health services and leadership coaching. He has worked in a wide range of settings with diverse populations and clinical issues, which makes him the perfect person to answer our mental health questions. To protect your privacy, Steve will be careful in his answers. While he may not be able to respond to a specific situation in this webinar format, he will be happy to respond privately after the session. We'll share his contact information later if anyone wishes to contact him directly. Throughout today's session, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. Welcome, Steve.
Hi, Doris. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the introduction.
You're welcome. So to start off our session today, we do have some questions that were pre-submitted to us. So I am going to start with the first one. That is, how can I effectively manage stress in a high-pressure manufacturing environment?
That's actually a really good question because, the thing about stress in and of itself is not a bad thing. Stress is actually one of those survival mechanisms that helps keep us alive. So if you've ever been about to cross the road and you see out of the corner of your eye a bus coming towards you, stress response is the thing that has you jump back. So we don't want to say that stress in itself is a bad thing. However, when we have an accumulation of stress or a stressful situation that we feel it starts to become troubling for us, it can have a lot of negative impacts. So obviously we want to be mindful about how we look after ourselves. So as we know, manufacturing is a dynamic and really challenging work environment, particularly, for individuals who had to go to work every single day during COVID. They know firsthand how stressful that would be. So while I like to, when we talk about stress, there are things that an individual can do, but it's important that there's organizational supports there as well. So, if I can come up with a simple list, that it's been proven helpful for most people. And again, I think it's important also to mention that's what's worked for one person might not work the same way for somebody else. So whatever we try to do, we want to personalize it to work best for ourselves. So the first one is, when you're at work, make sure you take your regular breaks. That's really important because, we sometimes tell ourselves or believe that I can just keep on powering through. But the human body isn't a limitless battery. We kind of we lose our charge as we go through the day. And by taking a break, it actually allows us to, rehydrate, drink some water, go to the bathroom, have some food, and just give ourselves a mental break from the task. So doing that can be very helpful just for maintaining our physical and mental well-being. It's also really helpful, for people to engage in some degree of physical activity. Now, some people get a little bit concerned to go, oh, I don't want to go to the gym. I don't want to lift weights. Well, you don't have to do that. Really, all we're talking about is making sure that you're getting your heart rate up. And the latest numbers we're talking about is about 150 minutes a week of just increasing your heart rate. By doing that, it actually reduces our stress, on a physiological and psychological level. And one of the interesting things about exercise is, well, we're all sitting here looking at a screen right now. And, when we evolved as a species, we never looked at screens. Screens are a very modern invention. And so most of us never sat all day long either. So the human body was made to move, and it's a natural stress reducer. And when it comes to, mild to moderate, depression and anxiety, for example, it's been shown that exercise, again, that 150 minutes accumulated through a week, is actually as helpful as medication and therapy for many people. That's one. It's important. One of the things that we can also do is engage in, relaxation techniques. So like deep breathing, for example. Interesting thing about breathing is a really important thing that keeps you alive. And yet when we're really stressed, we tend to breathe very shallow. So just by stopping and taking a moment just to take some really deep breaths, maybe close our eyes and focus on that breath, that can really help reduce stress. There's also on my phone here, there's also a million wonderful mindfulness apps that you can get on your phone that can actually help you breathe or help you engage in really simple mindfulness activities that can take 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. So if you kind of intersperse these through your day, that can be very helpful. Another thing that we can do, maintain open communication. Communicate with our colleagues, our supervisors about our workload and our challenges, because nobody can read our mind. We sometimes, we hope people will notice, but unless we actually speak up and be open about our stressors, nobody will know that it's existing for you. Set some boundaries, sometimes we have to, when we're at work, it's always a tough thing to say no to things. But sometimes, we might be able to say to our supervisor, I have to, right now, I'm feeling very overwhelmed. Can we look at, doing this in a different way, or, limiting the amount of overwork that I'm doing, for example. So there's a lot, rely on your colleagues, communicate to each other, use each other as a social support network. That also has been shown to reduce stress. And if you really need to, and I'm a big advocate for this, seek professional help. If the level of stress that you're experiencing is causing physical illness, because we know that chronic stress does that, or if you're starting to feel depressed or anxious as a result, make an investment in your well-being and reach out and get some support.
Wow, a lot of takeaways there.
Yeah, that was a mouthful, wasn't it?
That was. Well, and it leads me to the next question that was asked. And I think you provided a lot of solutions to it. What steps can I take to promote self-care and mental well-being during breaks or downtime in a manufacturing setting? So as you said, perhaps exercise, the apps that you mentioned, anything else you'd like to add to that?
I think one thing that can be very helpful, I mentioned exercise, and it doesn't have to be a lot. I think one thing that we can really do is, if you have that break, some people say, I'm on my feet all day long. The last thing I want to do is move. But a little bit of movement actually can limit or reduce the feelings of fatigue that we have. And so if we just go for a walk around the block or the building, or take the stairs when we have an opportunity, or better yet, if we link that behavior of, that behavior of movement with being social, maybe we can actually develop our social networks and social support with a team member by saying, hey, I'd be saying with you, Therese, it's break time. Well, let's go for a walk around the building, right?
Mhm.
Let's do something like that. Again, it goes without saying that, we need to look after our physical needs. So the exercise is part of it. But, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten to work where, I'm thinking, I really need a drink of water. And hours and hours and hours go by where I haven't had that, or I miss a snack, right? Or I don't eat my lunch. And when we don't recharge, our physiology starts to suffer. And when we're hungry or dehydrated, we can't think as well, right? Our minds aren't as sharp and focused. So those are some really important things that we can do just in a workplace setting that can be helpful. And, if you are one of those people that works, has a desk, some people will eat their lunch at their desk. I'm a real big advocate. So Therese, I'm looking at you. It's really helpful and important to get away from that desk and have that mental break, because the human brain works better when we have rest. And again, we only have a finite capacity to maintain our concentration and our effort. So little breaks throughout the day can do a lot to reduce our stress and just make us healthier as we go throughout our day.
Okay, very good. So another question that came up is, what are some strategies to maintain work-life balance in a demanding manufacturing job, and really in any job, because I'm sure there's people from all types of industries today joining us. So what would be some suggestions?
Well, I think, again, there are things that we can do individually, and then there's organizational support that is very helpful here. But I'm also, and I think, as the older I get, the more I notice this in myself, maintaining that balance between my work life or my home life, that can be a very difficult thing to do. So sometimes, instead of looking at, because balance is kind of, rigid, right? If you ever remember, if you're a little kid on a teeter-totter and you try to balance on each end, it takes a lot of effort. So sometimes it can be more helpful to think about it as a work-life harmony, right? Where sometimes, so rather than being really strict and rigid, we allow ourselves some wiggle room, some flexibility in how we do it. So maybe if I have a pressing deadline at work, I know that I'll be putting in maybe a little bit more time there, but I'm very mindful and conscious of making sure that I take some corresponding time, to look after my own physical well-being. So some things that we can do around work-life balance. Obviously, I'm a big believer in the importance of sleep, right? We need to make sure that we get adequate sleep. A lot of us, though, we get tempted to, we're tired, we're stressed out, we want to zonk out in front of the TV. And, sometimes we prioritize Netflix over going to sleep, right? There's nothing, I don't know, there's nothing on Netflix that is worth sacrificing your sleep. That's number one. The other thing I think is really important in work-life balance too, is making sure that we actually have some things outside of work that we are engaged in. It could be, and I think it should be, our family, friends, and loved one. They should take a center place in our life, because again, at the end of the day, it's the relationships that make life worth living. Make sure you have time for your community, or maybe you're involved in sport. Maybe you go to a church or a religious, institution. Maybe you like to go out in nature. Make sure you prioritize those things and don't look at them as, well, I'll get around to it when I have time. The thing about having work-life harmony is prioritizing what's really important. And we should be prioritizing, really, from my opinion, our relationships, because they're the things that make life worth living. Prioritize time for our physical well-being. So it could be exercise, for example, or just getting out in nature. And, our community well-being, making sure that we have enough time to do that. And, resist sometimes the temptation to take on overwork or overtime. Sometimes it's important, but if we just kind of focus on only one part of our lives, work-life balance, it starts to erode and go out the window. So think about harmony, maybe rather than balance, and be forgiving on yourself. And it doesn't always work, but always be mindful. What are the things outside of my job that I have to really focus on to be happy?
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question that came in, And I think you touched on a little bit, but further to it, how can I identify and address signs of burnout or mental exhaustion in the workplace? For example, how to notice worker with mental health issue, and
Mhm.
how can we increase personal awareness about mental health? So there's like three questions in one
Couple
there.
of questions in there. So
So
let
the
me,
first one, signs of burnout or mental exhaustion in the workplace.
yes. And, we're actually seeing a pretty rapid increase in the number of people reporting burnout. And burnout is the result of long-term accumulated exposure to workplace stress. So burnout is really a work-related stress. And there are some things that we actually see when we're having burnout. And burnout actually affects us in kind of three different clusters. So we have physical symptoms, for example. One of the hallmark symptoms of burnout is absolute physical fatigue, right? Where, we're just we have no energy at all. So it's kind of like you always feel like you're dragging yourself. It's all you can do, just to function at work. And by the time you get home, you have nothing left to give, your friends, family, or loved ones. Physically, we tend to get a lot of physical symptoms and physical complaints. They can be headaches, for example, can be tightness in our chest. We can have, digestive issues, for example. We can suffer a lot from insomnia when we have burnout. Another thing that's a real hallmark of burnout is, the emotional symptoms that we get, and they can be pretty insidious because we start to feel, a real lack of fulfillment in our work. Like we start to feel stuck or hopeless or empty. We can have feelings of irritability and impatience that go along with that. We can also have, a sense of, detachment from the work that we do. We no longer feel like, engaged in the work or the people that we work with at work. So before burnout, maybe Doris, if you and I have been working together a long time, at one point, you and I would have been quite engaged. We'd talk regularly, we'd go for a walk around the building, on our break. But as the more burnt out I get, the more I start to push away and isolate from you, right? And when you do see me, I seem distracted or irritable, for example. We also see a lot of a loss of motivation and enthusiasm for things that we used to like doing. We also start to feel much more cynical and pessimistic about our ability. If we felt at one time really competent and skilled in the job that we do, now we're starting to feel like, oh, I'm no good at this. I'm not effective at all. I'm not doing well in my job. And then we have, the cognitive symptoms. And one of the things that happens when we're burnt out is we have a really hard time concentrating on a task. So it's kind of like if you've ever tried to read a book or read a chapter and you keep the same sentence over and over and over again because you just can't absorb it. We have a hard time with memory. It doesn't matter how many times somebody tells us, the information's not getting in there, and we can't focus on our tasks. So if we think about, the reduced concentration, inability to focus in a safety sensitive position, and many in manufacturing are, that actually increases the risk of getting physical injury. Again, yeah, and we have, decreased productivity and performance, and it can be hard to make decisions. So we start to feel really, really burnt out. And so, burnt out, right? And so it's important to know that, burnout can have really negative impacts on our physical, emotional, and psychological well-being, but also with our relationships, with people at work, but also with our loved ones at home. So burnout's a real problem. And if we can identify these symptoms before they get too bad, we can start to do some things about it, like some of the things I've mentioned earlier.
Okay, thanks. Well, we've got a lot of questions coming in. And before we turn to those questions, I just want to remind our audience, if you have a question for Steve, please submit it through the Q&A. We will address as many as we can until our time is up. So the next one is, Steve, how do safety professionals manage the delicate balance of being a safety manager versus turning into a counselor when workers overshare and will not use the EAP?
That's a really good question, and it's a tricky one, because as colleagues, as supervisors, anybody who works with somebody else, I really believe that most of us actually do care a lot about our colleagues. One of the important things that we want to remember, though, when we're in a workplace setting, when we're on the health and safety committee or a colleague or a supervisor is we don't want to turn into a therapist or a counselor, because that would be inappropriate. And the workplace is not the place to do that. So what we want to be doing, is first of all, noticing that we have a colleague who's struggling, right? And there's a number of ways to identify that. It can be changes in behavior that are kind of out of the ordinary. Somebody who was once kind of really outgoing or involved starts to withdraw a lot. We can see people again with, their performance at work is decreasing, but we're also noticing, them either saying or they're physically exhausted or more tired than normal. We're noticing, changes in their mood. So they seem more down or depressed than usual, or they seem more anxious and irritable than normal. So we start to notice these behaviors. And so the thing that we want to do without being a counselor, you don't need to be a counselor to do this, is first of all, you want to identify, my colleague is struggling. And what we would do is, what I would do and recommend doing is, Doris, if I saw that you were struggling, I would want to approach you in a setting that is kind of private. I don't want to be talking about it in front of a whole bunch of people. But I would like to say, Doris, I've noticed that you haven't been joining us in the lunchroom lately. How are you doing? I'm worried about you. Stop and then see if, give you some time and some space to respond to that. I would let you know, I'm just concerned about you and I'm here to help. Helping isn't being a therapist, right? Helping is just being a caring and understanding colleague, coworker, or human being. One of the things that we can do to be helpful, again, is saying, what do you need? Being mindful that what they ask for, we might not be able to give it to them, right? So they might say, I'm just feeling really, really tired right now, and then we might talk about that. Well, maybe you need to take an extra break, or maybe, maybe it'd be safer if you take a sick day today, right? I might ask them if we have an employee and family assistance program. One of the things I would do is I would say, have you contacted our EFAP program? And sometimes people who have EFAP programs go, what's that? Well, then if I was a member of a joint health and safety committee, or a supervisor, I would want to make sure that all the people that work in the organization, in the company, know about the resources that are available to them. Have them, they can be on a SharePoint site, or they can be on like an actual physical, board in the staff break room. A resource that people don't know about isn't really very helpful. So I would recommend, have you reached out to that? Have you talked to your family doctor? But the last thing we want to do is start probing, right? Start asking for, asking those kind of counselory questions. So, so tell me about your mother, right? Tell me about your home life. That's not helpful and that's not appropriate.
Well, it's funny. I mean, not funny, but you brought up the EAP program and making sure employees are aware of it. And someone that is joining us that joined us today is saying, is there a way to encourage employees to utilize the EAP? Because one of the attendees has found that their company has experienced a very low utilization rate.
Yeah, and that is a real problem. I mean, sometimes we can have really great resources and the company can have them available, but people don't use them. And there can be a number of reasons for that. Sometimes it's, when people need to go to the EAP, if it's, EAP's changed a lot since COVID. And at one point, EAPs were traditionally in the office. So a person would have to actually leave their workplace and go to an office, travel, pay for parking, take time off of work. That made it a barrier in and of itself. Nowadays, many EAPs also have virtual. So you don't actually have to, necessarily leave your office. But I would always make sure if you are using an EAP in your work setting, you're in a very private place so that you can maintain confidentiality. But so sometimes it was the lack of ability to get there, right? Or maybe it's, I can't take the time during my day at work, right? That can be an, so sometimes if organizations can say, you know what, for this purpose, we're okay with you doing this because it's helpful. Sometimes though, and I think this is a significant one, people don't use their EAP because of stigma. And stigma is still a significant source of concern for supporting individuals who are struggling with mental health. And when we think about what stigma are those negative beliefs and attitudes that we hold for people with mental health issues. ideas that, well, you know, people who are mentally ill are just faking it. They just want attention. Or if, you know, people with mental illness, hey, you know, life is hard. Just pull up your big boy britches and get on with it, right? We have all these ideas, and stigma can come from externally, you know, from the world around us. If all you have to do is watch TV, and you can see how mental illness is often portrayed, not in a very friendly way, right? So it comes externally, or we hear stigmatizing words and language from the people around us, you know, where we refer to people as being crazy or lunatics. So if I've got a mental health issue that I'm trying to keep secret, and I hear people using that kind of language, the last thing I'm going to do is say, you know what, I'm struggling.
Yeah.
So stigma also is one of those things that it can come from the outside, but it also can come from the inside too, because we can actually believe those things. And when it happens to us, we shame ourselves and we say, I'm not going to be weak, right? So how we reduce stigma is, first of all, you know, we educate ourselves. You know, we make sure that we know what the myths are versus the reality around mental health. We create some mental health literacy, so to speak, by having training so that you can identify, you know, when you are struggling or when colleagues are struggling. We can understand that about 1 in 3, well, actually before COVID, the number was about 1 in 5, but now since COVID, the number has gone to about 1 in 3 people in their lifetime will struggle with a diagnosable mental health issue. And so that means that a third of the people who are on this webinar are going to struggle or are struggling right now with a mental health issue. Stigma makes it hard for people to say anything. So get educated about what mental health is and what it looks like, those mythologies. Talk about it, you know, be open about it. You know, if somebody has a broken arm, we typically are like, hey, you know, in the old days, hey, can I sign your cast? You know, that's not a big deal. But with mental illness, we still have this kind of, oh, I don't know. So talk about it openly. So if we can reduce stigma in the organization, that can actually see people making use of EAPs, because they're a really, really helpful resource, you know, to people. They're, for many people, you know, they're the first access point into mental health treatment. So if a company has it and it's being underutilized, consider those things: awareness, reduce stigma, normalize it. In staff meetings, have your toolbox talk or your safety moment where you encourage people to actually talk about mental health and normalize it. Because if we think about 1 in 3 people, that is, you know, that's 1 in 3 people who will experience it personally.
Yeah.
But if we look at, you know, if I was to, you know, I can see the numbers of the people here, there's over 70. If I could ask everybody in their room to put their hands up, how many people in this group know of somebody, a friend, a family member, a loved one who has a mental health issue? How many people know a colleague who has a mental health issue? How many people just walking around or, you know, being in the community see people that they perceive as likely struggling with mental health? It's shocking how many people are struggling. And so the more we can normalize it, the more I think people will say, you know what, going to EAP isn't something to be embarrassed about or ashamed of. It's actually really healthy, and it's a good thing for me to do to invest in my well-being.
Okay. Just as you were sharing and providing some great answer, a comment that just came in about EAP. And their comment is, in my workplace, some workers have raised concerns about the quality of resources on the EAP, and so prefer to go elsewhere for support. What would be your thoughts about that?
Well, I would say that, you know, when an EAP is a service provider, and when I have people, you know, coming back and saying, you know, I'm dissatisfied with this service, I think that the company, we need to go back to that EAP and raise those concerns and say, this is what we're experiencing, because you're paying for that service. And so that service needs to be accountable for you. Sometimes what happens when people go to an EAP as well is, you know, they get assigned to a counselor, and this counselor might be well-trained, but counseling is really the thing that predicts whether counseling is going to work is the relationship or the rapport you have with that counselor. And not everybody is going to work well with everybody. I kind of liken it to, you know, Doris, well, do you like hamburgers, Doris? You know, you probably do. Most people do, right? So you can go to, you know, if we just kind of pick the easy ones, McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy, you know, Five Guys. There's a lot of places to get burgers. It's all cow on a bun, but you might have one that works better for you than others. You might choose, Burger King over the rest of them just because that's what you like. So when we go to an EAP and we meet with a mental health clinician or a counselor for the first time, I always say, look at that first session with them as though you were interviewing them. How does it fit? How does it feel? Does my counselor seem interested in the issues that I want to talk about, right? Rather than what the counselor wants to talk about. Is the counselor, being very clear about, the goal that I have or my needs? Does the counselor check in, throughout the session to say, are we still talking about what's important to you? Does the counselor talk more about their stuff than your stuff? Those are all things that can kind of happen. And sometimes we just get into a counseling session with somebody and we open the door and we go, oh, that Steve guy reminds me of the dude in high school who used to pick on me. And no matter how good Steve is, I don't want to talk to him, right? So use that first session and sometimes, and feel okay to say, you know what, I would like to phone back the EAP and say, I would like to try a different one. That can be really helpful. One of the things I will also say about EAPs and counseling in general is, counseling also requires a good therapist, but as a client, we also have to invest in the process, right? We have to be involved in it because getting well is ultimately we have to do the work. I always kind of look at it like if you go to if you want to get in really good shape and you go to a really good trainer, that trainer can be the best trainer in the world. But if you're not going to lift up the weights, you're never going to get those muscles you want. So sometimes, we have to look at the fit, make sure that, our company is, getting back to those EAPs and saying, the service, we're not seeing what we'd like, let's talk about what we can do about that. And sometimes it's just as we go in and we think, all I have to do is show up. Counseling works when we're actually invested in the process.
Okay, thank you. Another question that's just come in: if a worker claims to have a mental health problem and presents a doctor's note indicating that they are on leave for a month or two, would it be better to ask further questions to the doctors so we can understand the nature of this problem so that we can provide this worker with suitable accommodations while they recover?
Well, that is a really interesting question because one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that when an individual has a mental health issue, that is treated the same way as a physical health issue. So that's the nature of the mental health issue in itself is confidential, right? So it can be very helpful. Again, we have our partner, TextMed. They can be like an organization like TextMed can be very helpful in terms of working, with the disability management process and ensuring a successful return to work. Because that's a really delicate time when somebody's off for mental health leave. Not only are they off work and probably worried about it, most people who are on mental health leave, that time is for them to get better, right? And not to be overly stressed out about, oh my gosh, what's happening when I'm at work. People with a mental health issue also tend to come back worried about how are other people perceiving me. So yeah, it can be a very good, it's very helpful if a doctor will actually say, these are the things that we want to see happen. But not all doctors have the training or the ability to really assess that. So again, a disability management partner like TextMed can be very helpful. And again, though, it can just be helpful as well, when an employee is on leave, to check in with them, periodically and just say, this is, Steve, I'm your manager. Hopefully they know that I'm their manager, or Doris, just checking in. How are you doing? Right? I'm not asking you about, your diagnosis. I'm not probing. I'm not telling you about all the work that's stacking up, right? Because that creates more stress. I'm just checking in to let you know, hey, I'm just thinking about you and I care about you. As we get closer, maybe 2 weeks out, I'm going to contact and say, so, you're coming back and we just want to make sure that your return's successful. Let's talk about a plan that would make the most sense for you. Because you might get that information from a doctor. They're not all created equal in this regard. Maybe, again, if you've worked with a partner like TextMed, you'll have a pretty good plan to come back to. If you don't, it's, what would be helpful for you to integrate back? Usually people, when they're off leave for a while, they need some adjustment period, right? Just having them come in, they've had time off, and getting them right back at, 100 miles an hour isn't the best way to do it. So maybe we start with a graduated return for the first couple of weeks. Maybe we modify some tasks for the first couple of weeks. Very important, though, that we have an open discussion with the employee so that we're all on the same page about what the expectations are. I want to know, as an employer, I want to be very clear about, what my responsibilities are. And as an employer, we have a fair number of them in terms of accommodations. But I also want the employee to know that they actually they're part of this process too, right? There's things that they need to do to ensure their well-being. And we want to make sure that we have a mechanism for talking about if there are problems, right? Maybe that employee comes back and they're like, oh, this is too much. Rather than that employee feeling like, I can't say anything, and exacerbating and actually making it more likely that they might need another leave, let's have a way of discussing problems before they get big so that we can ensure, again, gradual return, don't throw them in the deep end right away, let people acclimatize. But I think it really, if I'm going to emphasize one thing, a disability partner, management partner can be extremely helpful when we have return to work situations.
Okay, so that leads, I guess you've answered the next question as well, but I will still ask it in case there's anything else you can suggest. The question is, what resources are available for employers to support return to work after a mental health injury?
Well, again, I would say that it sounds like an infomercial for our partner. So forgive me for that. But again, companies like TextMed, and again, there are other companies out there who do this kind of work. They are experts in this process. And this is a really important process. And if we don't have as a manager or as a company, we might not have the size and the scale to have staff dedicated to doing this, right? If I'm on a small team and I'm, maybe I'm the owner and the supervisor and everything, I don't have the expertise to do this. Or, so again, having that expertise is really important. I mean, there are resources out there, but we always have to be careful about what we do. So my first thing would be, make use of the expertise that's available and out there. But again, and just alluding to the things I said before is, reach out, prepare that return, so that everybody's on the same page about what the expectations are, and check in often to make sure that it's a smooth transition. And expect hiccups, because that's kind of like human nature. We tell ourselves we can have a perfect plan, but perfect is the enemy of good. So prepare for things to come up. And how do we talk about those?
Okay. Yeah. And further to that, we also ourselves have a webinar coming up in September that will be bring some resources and information around return to work policies. And we'll be sharing more information about that at the end of today's session. So
yeah, I mean, for anybody who's interested in that, I think that would be an actually essential webinar to attend, because that, again, you'll be getting that from somebody who's an expert in disability.
Okay. Another question, if an employee is not declaring safely to someone appropriate within the company, but that they are suffering, how do you approach the employee?
Well, again, we want to approach it delicately. The first thing we do but we do want to address it. If we're noticing it or if we're being informed about concerns. And again, I'm a big, when it comes to safety is the priority. So when there's safety, we cannot avoid certain things. And my experience over the decades has told me, when we avoid like mental health issues, they don't get better on their own, right? They tend to grow. So if I'm a manager or an HR or somebody, and I'm made aware, either through an employee telling me these things, or I'm observing the behavior myself, then it's incumbent upon me to approach that employee again in a private setting and say, I'm worried about you. We want to be compassionate. We want to be humane. We want to be empathic, right? We're not going in there, like guns a-blazing, so to speak. We want to think about, if I'm approaching somebody with a concern, remember the impact of stigma. People can be pretty sensitive about this. And, one of the interesting things about people with mental illness, people who are like mentally ill, try really, really hard most of the time to pretend they're not, right? right? That's just kind of because we don't want to be found out. So if I know somebody who's struggling, I will approach him. I'll say, hey, Doris, I'd like to have just a conversation with you. Make sure it's in a private setting and say, I've been made aware of, or, I've observed this, and I focus on the behaviors I've seen or the behaviors reported. We don't want to make it overly, personalized and say, what's wrong with you? I've noticed these behaviors, right? Again, I've noticed that usually, there's been a few more mistakes and accidents, and, I'm just worried about your well-being. How are you doing? That would be the intro to having that conversation. Now, sometimes an employee will say, you know what? Yeah, I'm really struggling, right? And that makes it a lot easier because they've told you. And now we can have a meaningful conversation about things that, what steps can we take to support you? Steps can be, sometimes we have some latitude organizationally to offer some kind of accommodations that don't require a formal process, but always make sure if you are a manager and you're doing that, be very, very aware of what your company policy is around that. Don't overstep it. But, and sometimes what happens as an employee, they'll actually, go to their doctor and get documentation so you can have a formalized accommodation process in place. That's the best in terms of like being helpful. But sometimes employees are going to say, you know what? No, everything's fine. I'm good. I'm really good. Well, okay, we as an employer, we do have that obligation to inquire. So if we're noticing performance issues, we do want to make sure that we're asking, okay, so I'm noticing the performance here is, it's not like it's not the quality we're used to seeing from you. I'm worried about you, right? If that employee says, no, I'm good. You can't force a mental health confession out of somebody, right? We want to be mindful that we just, we ask, right? And then if that employee, we watch and we ask, and that employee isn't willing to share that, then, what really turns into is then it becomes more of a performance discussion, right? But I always encourage people, but, I don't take again, I don't go in all guns a-blazing and go really hard. I say, just noticing that you might need some support. Are you aware of the EAP program? If you have that, if you don't, there's other resources in the community that we can investigate for you, but make them aware that I'm noticing that there's something going on and follow up with that person. Don't just notice it, mention it, and drop it. Say, well, let's have okay, I'm going to reach out to you again in a couple of days just to see how things are going. That employee might have had a turn, they might feel that, okay, you know what, maybe I should tell my boss or my supervisor that I'm struggling. They still might not. If your employee doesn't tell you, there's not much you can do about that. We want to be careful not to make assumptions that there is a mental health issue. We don't want to assume there isn't one either. So it's a bit delicate. But if they won't tell you, and you've done everything in your power to let them know that there's resources available, that there's support available, then it becomes more of a performance management conversation.
Right. Okay. So on the flip side, we've had a question come in where, let's say the employee states that their mental health is affecting their work. But when you've asked them, are you getting help or have you seen a doctor? They're like, no, I don't need to. Can an employer request a doctor's note after an employee has stated that their mental health is impacting how
That's actually a really good question. And to be honest, I don't know whether they can mandate that. I do not believe they can, right? But again, if an employee is saying, I'm struggling, we might be able as a company to do some minor shifts, right? But we have to be careful not if the employee is not willing to do their part, because again, it's not just the employer who carries the whole burden here. The employee who's struggling also has to step up. It's hard, but this is their wellness. This is their well-being, right? And they have to play a significant role in working towards that. So if they're saying that there's a problem, but they're not willing to actually do anything about it, then employers' hands get kind of tied, and it's a difficult place to be. You still want to be empathic and supportive. You still want to make sure that the resources are available. You still want to make sure you're reaching out. But ultimately, at the end of the day, again, that employee has to be willing to say, yeah, I need support and I need some help with this.
Okay. And if, it is impacting their work, I guess, like you said earlier, then it'll end up becoming a performance management that you kind of have to try and massage into the
Yeah.
conversation that
Yeah, and performance
making
management can
mistakes
sound
or
very
accident.
scary, right? They sound like,
Yeah,
a performance management conversation doesn't have to be like dropping a ton of bricks on someone.
exactly.
We can have a very supportive performance management conversation where we're
Yeah,
still talking about our worries and concerns for that person.
exactly.
But
Yeah.
this is like, we want to see you develop. We want to see you be successful. So how can we work with you to be successful?
For sure. So here's a bit of a different question. We know that leaders leading by example and taking care of their own mental health is a major factor in having overall psychologically healthy and safe workplace. What are the biggest things that employers can do to ensure that their leaders have the tools available to do this?
Well, I think it goes without saying. I mean, I'm a big believer in awareness.
Mhm.
Leaders, it's a hard gig being a leader. It really is. And there's a lot of pressure in those roles. And, sometimes, I think we're seeing a shift as, the younger generations are coming up. And, younger generations are pretty cool in this way because they're like, you know what? I need support and I'm going to do something about it. Whereas, the older generations, we were more like, well, I just suck it up, right? Just suck it up and get through it. But I've done in many years of providing like mental health awareness for leaders in particular, because I think in an organization, we can't just bottom load all this responsibility on the employees. Leaders are the ones that set the tone. They're the role models. So when we can get a group of leaders in a room and, in a safe environment and provide that, mental health management for leaders education, again, we dispel the myths. We talk about the numbers. We talk about the impact that stigma has on people. We talk about the signs and symptoms and what we can do. Almost every single time I've been involved in something, I've been involved in dozens and dozens in multiple settings. Those leaders always start going, they open their eyes and they start being vulnerable with each other, right? And they start talking and they become aware. That awareness training is a really critical piece, right? For leaders to start making those steps. So if I'm an owner of a company and I'm invested in the well-being of my employees, I want to be equally invested in the well-being of my supervisors, my managers, and I want them to be well and have that education and training because they're the role models. Everybody's going to be taking their cue for what the leaders do. So if a leader, and we know, like we always know, if we have a manager, a supervisor, or a boss who's not doing well, it's not a secret. We can always tell that they're struggling. And so if I'm a frontline employee and I see my boss struggling, but denying that they're struggling and trying to, tough it out, that sends a signal to me of what's expected from me, that I should keep my mouth shut because my boss doesn't talk about it. My boss says that we should just push it through. So we set a tone. So I think, as leaders, again, that awareness, right? Be aware of it and be very mindful about, and this is a tough one for a lot of leaders, role model taking a break, right? Hard to do, but you need to do it. Role model going on a vacation. Again, hard to do, but you need to do it. When you have a team meeting, again, talk about mental health issues in a normalized way. Whenever I've done these mental health management for leaders courses, one of the important things I always ask people to do who attend those is, first of all, pick one thing we've talked about today and try it out as soon as we get out. But I also encourage people the next time you have a team meeting, let your team know you attended this workshop on mental health awareness. Talk about what you learned, engage in a conversation. And as a leader, hold yourself accountable. If I want my employees to be healthy, I gotta walk the talk.
Okay, that's great advice.
I'm on a soapbox, aren't I?
You are. What do you do when you don't have a supportive work environment or don't have a positive social support available to you?
I mean, and that's a really tough one because we are seeing, loneliness and isolation is an epidemic. We're
Yes.
seeing it, and particularly in North American and Western culture, where, we're all connected through our social media, but it's no substitute for a real human interaction. So we might be more connected, but we're more disconnected than we ever have been. We're disconnected from family, friends, colleagues, coworkers. We're often even disconnected from ourselves. Like we don't know ourselves anymore. So that loneliness can be really problematic. And it can be hard, particularly when we're in an environment where people aren't as aware or as welcoming of this conversation. Again, I think it can be, this is tough because it puts kind of the onus on the individual. But when we're in these environments, I mean, first of all, it's, all the things you can do around your own self-care are important. All the things we mentioned earlier, sleep, nutrition, exercise, mindfulness. It can be hard to be vulnerable and take a chance, but get out and join a club, and people go, oh, I don't want to join a club, it's the worst thing I would. And I would say that too, like, oh, don't make me join a club, right? But we need to do something that gets us interacting with other people. That's for our own self-care and well-being. At work, again, it's important to communicate with your manager and say, I would like us to talk more about mental health. They might say, no, we're not doing that. Okay. They might surprise you and say, yeah, I think that's a good idea. How would we do this? And then that trusty employee would say, well, we should contact the Manufacturing Safety Alliance at BC because they can help us, because we can.
Oh my.
It might be something just starting with, just little moments where we, with our team members, rather than going in, so Doris, how's your mental wellness today? It's like, Doris, how are you doing? How are you looking after yourself? Like, what did you do on the weekend? Start these small engagements where we just start to introduce topics. I think it's important, sometimes we need to insist, and this can be hard to do, that look, we're not, as a team, we need to do more about mental illness and mental health. Sometimes, and this is maybe a controversial thing to say, if we're in an environment though that does not recognize the importance of our mental well-being or the well-being of our colleagues, and if we've done the things that we need to do to try to raise that awareness, sometimes we need to make a choice, right? Is this an environment that's healthy for me, or can I look for other ones? And I'll tell you, just my short time working at the Alliance, I've met a number of companies that are really, really invested and enthusiastic about their employees' mental health and well-being. Like it really matters to them and they really care. So there are supportive companies out there. There are supportive bosses out there. I think it's more supportive now than it's ever been, right? So that's a tough decision to have to make. Yeah. But our health and well-being is it's the most important resource that we have, right? So again, there are no easy answers to this either. I mean, that's probably one of the toughest questions that I get.
Yeah. Okay. Another question. Do you find that crisis intervention programs help prevent workers from further long-standing issues? One of our members has recently had an incident, and unfortunately the crew failed to use it, even though the employer set it up at the plant for the convenience.
Well, that's the thing, right? I like psychological first aid, for example. I think that is incredibly important and incredibly helpful. And actually, that's why, the MSABC, we're developing our own psychological health and safety first aid course for our members. So when we have people who are trained, that's great. But if an incident happens and no one makes use of that training, it's not going to be helpful. So I don't know if the question is, we used it and it wasn't helpful, or we had the incident and it wasn't used, and of course it won't be helpful.
Yeah. Right? Mm-hmm. I think the question was that, yeah, that's what it is. Unfortunately, the crew failed to use it, even though it was set up and provided to them and at the plant. So it was convenient, and the workers still didn't, take an opportunity and advantage of it.
Yeah. And again, we go back to maybe it's stigma, right? Again, and I think there's a lot of awareness that, and I'm a big believer in education and training. It's so important as a starting place to get the dialogue going. I mean, this is a pretty specific situation, so there's a lot of variables that could have been playing there. So I don't want to, make assumptions. So maybe there was, maybe again, it was the stigma around it. Maybe it could be that, the folks who were trained in it maybe they didn't feel comfortable, right? Sometimes we have a training and it's like one and done. I've trained and then months go by, weeks, like, 7, 8 months go by, no incident. And when it happens, it's like, I really can't remember what to do, right? And sometimes we get a little bit freaked out by having to deal with something for the first time. So these trainings are very helpful, but we also have to keep those learnings alive, right? Or else we forget them. It's like anything, right? You don't practice it, you lose it. Sometimes people go to trainings, not necessarily because they're really interested in doing it, but because they're told to do it. So I'm always a big believer that when we have psych first aid courses, choose your champions, like the ones who really buy into it, right? And as an organization, support them in doing this. So let your colleagues, let everybody know that it exists and that it can be helpful. So again, it's a pretty specific question about a pretty specific situation, but a lot of reasons why it might not have worked the way we wanted to.
Well, and I think I would encourage maybe the person that asked that question to perhaps reach out to you after, and maybe they can share a little bit more of the details and you can offer some further suggestions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be helpful.
Yeah. We still have so many questions, but we're running out of time. So unfortunately, this is going to be our last question for today. What kind of mental health education do you recommend for managers, leaders, or supervisors? And where can one access those courses?
Well, doesn't this sound like a convenient question?
It came from the audience.
It came from the audience. So yeah, so Manufacturing Safety Alliance, one of our mandates is to provide this level of training. So last week, we actually just partnered, we just did a pilot for a mental health management for leaders course. So this course will be available coming up by the end of August and September. I recommend for leaders, take this course because it will educate you and provide you with the knowledge and the tools to prepare you to work in an environment, so you can be confident, you can be more skilled, you can have some tools in your toolbox to respond appropriately and helpfully to people with mental health issues in your workplace. Again, we are developing our own psychological first aid and safety course. And we've got a number of complementary courses for members right now that we actually have available. And again, it's this list is expanding. So we have a mental health awareness in the workplace that's geared more towards employees. It's about a 1-hour course. We have our bullying and harassment course. We're having a promoting mental health and well-being course. We have a stress management course called Stress Less, Live for More. We have a resilience course. And we have the emotional intelligence and psych safety course for leaders. So we're actually developing a pretty broad number of training courses, and we've got more coming. So, check in with us all the time. Make sure, reach out to your advisor and ask them, what's new on the training scene, or email me directly and I can give you the, the scoop on what's coming up for you. But there's a lot of training that we're having available for folks that will really help support themselves and their organizations to be more psychological healthy and safe.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you for your insightful answer, Steve. So many important considerations for the day-to-day and good information to include in our health and safety programs. And definitely our advisors can assist with that and can put you in touch with Steve if our audience has more questions and concerns they'd like to talk to Steve about.
Yeah, again, I encourage folks to reach out, and this is a very important issue in manufacturing. I mean, manufacturing is a unique industry with a lot of unique stressors that we don't see elsewhere. And manufacturing is a field where people we know are struggling. So do indeed reach out. And this has been really, really fun. It's tested me. So I'm like, good. It's like an hour-long oral test. But I hope I passed.
Right. You did great, I think. So hopefully our audience thinks so as well. So yeah, we're a little bit over time. Actually, we were supposed to end a few minutes ago, so my apologies, but we want to thank you, Steve, again for everything that you've provided, the information. And thank you as well to TextMed Services for sponsoring today's session. To everyone in our audience, thank you for joining us today and sharing your questions. If we didn't get to yours, we'll do our best to respond to them in the follow-up posts and post them online along with a recording of today's session. And for more situation-specific questions, Steve will follow up with you directly. Before you go, we want to share with you some key dates coming up, so mark your calendars. On Friday, October 13th, we will be hosting health and safety community members from across BC once again at the Anvil Center for Make It Safe Vancouver. And 2 weeks later, on Thursday, October 26th and Friday, October 27th, we will be showcasing speakers and presenters from BC across Canada and around the world for Make It Safe online. Our theme this fall is world-class health and safety, and we'll be bringing in speakers to share best practices, insights, and ideas here in BC and abroad. This is a great opportunity to get your annual training hours in and to learn from some of the best in OHS. And if you've never attended Make It Safe, a health and safety conference, here's a short video.
Make It Safe is a great event. It really brings people together which share the same passion for safety.
We want to ensure that we're bringing great content, relevant content.
I really enjoy the learning opportunities and, of course, the networking part.
Meeting peers at the Make It Safe conferences are a great way to learn from one another.
Make It Safe conferences targeted the right subject content that everyone's asking for.
And lastly, also this September, we have 2 Make It Safe Expert Series webinars happening. So as well, mark your calendars for these. The first one will be on Thursday, September 14th, where Kristen Sieben, the Return to Work Team Manager for TextMed Services, will share information and strategies you can use to navigate barriers to return to work. The second one will be a few days later, on Tuesday, September 19th. This webinar will have Frank Hamadi from WorkSafe BC's Prevention Services Division, focusing on how to use the employer portal as a tool to help you reduce your WorkSafe BC insurance premiums. We'll be emailing out information on each of these free webinars in the next couple of weeks, so keep your eye on your inbox. And if you're in the Lower Mainland, the Alliance is hosting a free members-only workshop on mental health at work on Thursday, September 21st. In this half-day event, Steve will be in person in Langley to talk about mental health essentials at work, bullying and harassment, and building resilience. Lunch will be provided as well, but seats are limited, so sign up today through the link in the chat. And visit us online for help or to access our full library of webinars, resources, and training. Watch for an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of today's session and a survey link to share your feedback and topic ideas. Thank you again, everyone, for attending.